The alarm on Sarah Mitchell's phone buzzed at 4:47 a.m., exactly 40 minutes before sunrise. She didn't need the alarm anymore. Her internal clock had synchronized with military precision over the past 12 years. Her eyes opened in the darkness of her modest two-bedroom apartment in Las Vegas, just 20 miles from Nellie's Air Force Base. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the silence before the city would wake. This quiet moment, these few minutes before the world demanded anything from her, belonged entirely to herself. She cherished them fiercely. Sarah swung her legs out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool hardwood floor. At 42 years old, she moved with the efficiency of someone who had choreographed every morning the same way for over a decade. No wasted motion, no unnecessary thought. Discipline had become her second language, her native tongue. She walked to the bathroom, splashed cold water on her face, and looked at her reflection in the mirror. Intelligent brown eyes stared back at her. Eyes that had seen 2 divorces, 3 career promotions, and the weight of knowing that her decisions determined whether people lived or died. In the kitchen, Sarah prepared her coffee with the precision of a scientist measuring compounds for an experiment. 2 scoops of medium roast, filtered water heated to exactly 200 degrees, steeped for 4 minutes. While it brewed, she reviewed the morning briefing on her secure tablet, weather patterns over Nevada and the surrounding regions, aircraft schedules, notable training exercises, personnel updates. Her mind absorbed information like a sponge, cataloging details that might matter later. This was the real work, not the dramatic moments that made headlines, but the meticulous preparation that prevented disasters before they happened. By 5:30 a.m., Sarah was dressed in her uniform, the dark blue flight suit that hung in her closet like armor waiting to be donned. Every button aligned perfectly, every crease sharp enough to cut. The name tape on her chest read MICHELL, and below that, embroidered in red lettering that only close observers would notice, was her call sign, Phoenix. She'd earned that name 8 years ago when she guided a crippled C-130 with 2 failed engines safely to the runway. The pilots had called her heroic. She'd called herself her job. The drive to Nellie's took exactly 19 minutes from her apartment, and Sarah knew every traffic light on the route. She navigated the pre-dawn streets of Las Vegas with the same calculated precision she applied to everything else. Radio stations played soft morning news, stories about politics, celebrity gossip, weather. Nothing that mattered. Sarah kept her focus on the road, on the growing light in the eastern sky, on the mental preparation for what lay ahead. The base gate appeared through the darkness, and Sarah pulled up to the security checkpoint. The guard, Sergeant Martinez, recognized her immediately and waved her through with a smile. "Good morning, Major. Quiet night." "So far," Sarah replied, her lips curving slightly upward. It was the closest thing to a joke she allowed herself. Quiet nights and quiet mornings were when the most dangerous mistakes happened, when minds wandered, when attention fractured. The control tower loomed against the lightening sky, a massive structure bristling with antennas and radar dishes. Sarah had walked through those doors nearly 4,000 times. She knew every hallway, every corner, every square inch of the facility. This was her kingdom, her domain, the place where her expertise and authority were absolute. But unlike most kingdoms, hers existed in the vertical space above hundreds of square miles of Nevada desert. Inside the tower, the atmosphere was already humming with pre-shift activity. Screens glowed with data streams, voices crackled softly over radios, and the soft electronic chirping of systems monitoring systems created an ambient soundtrack that Sarah found oddly soothing. Her team was already arriving, some just finishing the night shift, others beginning to settle in for the day ahead. She nodded greetings, reading the subtle language of fatigue or alertness in their postures. These were good people, trained and dedicated, but Sarah never forgot that they were human. Humans made mistakes. That's why she was here. Sarah climbed the stairs to the main control room where the real magic happened. Her chair, positioned at the center of a curved console, awaited her. Around her, massive windows offered a panoramic view of the airfield, runways stretching like pale ribbons, hangars scattered across the landscape, and the endless desert beyond. The sky was beginning to transform from black to deep purple to the first hints of blue. In another 20 minutes, the sun would break the horizon, and the day would officially begin. She settled into her chair and ran through the pre-shift checklist with her senior controller, Tom Reeves, a veteran with 20 years of experience. Communication systems, check. Radar functioning properly, check. Emergency protocols reviewed, check. Weather updates confirmed, check. Everything was green across the board. It was the kind of morning that made complacency whisper tempting lies, that today would be routine, that nothing unusual would happen, that she could coast through on autopilot. But Sarah knew better. She'd learned long ago that the universe didn't operate on a schedule. Disasters didn't announce themselves. They arrived like unexpected guests, demanding immediate and perfect responses. She had trained for every conceivable emergency: engine failures, hydraulic compromises, medical crises, mechanical failures, instrument malfunctions, weather emergencies, communication blackouts. Her mind was a library of what-ifs, and she had response protocols filed away in her memory like weapons in an arsenal. Her fingers wrapped around the warm coffee mug she'd brought from home. Steam rose from the surface, carrying the rich aroma of dark roast. Sarah took a careful sip, her eyes never leaving the screens and readouts surrounding her. Outside, the sun was beginning to peak above the eastern mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Another day at Nellie's was about to begin. At 6:30 a.m., the night shift supervisor approached her station with the final handoff briefing. Quiet night. No incidents. Standard traffic expected today. We've got 3 training squadrons scheduled, some cargo runs, and the usual rotation of test flights. Should be a normal Friday. Sarah nodded slowly, taking in the information. Normal Friday. She'd heard those words hundreds of times before, and yet something in her chest tightened. Something in her intuition, that subtle, inexplicable sixth sense that had saved her career multiple times, whispered that this particular Friday carried an electric charge. Call it premonition. Call it instinct. Call it the nervous electricity that crackled beneath her skin like distant lightning. She set down her coffee cup and took a deep breath. She was ready. The morning unfolded exactly as Sarah had anticipated. By 8:30 a.m., Nellie's was operating at full capacity. 3 F-16 fighter jets had launched on a training sortie 40 minutes earlier, climbing into the brilliant blue sky with the kind of aggressive grace that never failed to impress her. A cargo transport had landed smoothly at 7:55 a.m., and another was queued up for a 9:15 a.m. departure. Everything moved like a well-orchestrated symphony, each aircraft and instrument playing its part in perfect timing. Sarah sat at her console, monitoring everything with the kind of focused attention that had become second nature. Her team worked quietly around her, voices low and professional as they coordinated with incoming and outgoing flights. This was the rhythm she loved, the steady pulse of controlled chaos, the dance of logistics and physics and human skill. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, forgotten on the edge of her console. At 10:43 a.m., everything changed. Nellie's Tower, this is. The voice came through the radio, fractured and strained, carrying an undertone of barely contained panic that made every hair on Sarah's body stand on end. She immediately straightened in her chair, her hand instinctively moving toward the communication console. In 12 years, she'd heard hundreds of radio transmissions. She knew the difference between routine and catastrophic in the space of a single syllable. "Go ahead, aircraft calling Nellie's," Sarah replied, her voice steady and calm despite the sudden spike in her adrenaline. "Identify yourself." "Nellie's Tower, this is Lifeguard 27. We are a medical transport helicopter rotor wing." The pilot's voice cracked slightly. "We have multiple system failures. We are in a canyon approximately 30 miles northeast of your position, and we are—" He paused, and Sarah heard the sound of alarms blaring in the background. We are losing hydraulic pressure. Fast. Sarah's mind immediately began calculating. Lifeguard was the call sign for medical transport flights, critical organ transfers, emergency evacuation of patients in dire condition. A canyon 30 miles northeast meant the helicopter was outside her immediate controlled airspace, in a region where terrain dominated and options became severely limited. Hydraulic failure in a helicopter wasn't a problem. Hydraulic failure in a helicopter over mountainous terrain with a time-critical patient aboard was a nightmare scenario. Lifeguard 27, copy your last, Sarah said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made her team snap to attention. I need current altitude, heading, and condition of your patient. Current altitude 2,000 feet and descending, heading 170, the pilot responded, speaking faster now. Our patient is a donor heart, 22-minute transport window from harvest site to receiving hospital. Nellie's was supposed to be our refuel stop, but we're not going to make it there. We're losing hydraulic control on the cyclic. Instruments are intermittent. GPS just went offline. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up topographic maps of the area northeast of the base. The terrain was brutal, mountain ridges, deep canyons, scattered with desert vegetation and boulders. Finding a safe landing zone in that landscape would be like finding a needle in a haystack. And the pilot was losing instrumentation, which meant he was flying increasingly by feel and sight alone. Lifeguard 27, what is your current fuel state? Sarah asked, already knowing the answer was going to be bad. There was a pause that lasted 3 seconds but felt like 30. We have approximately 12 minutes of fuel remaining if we maintain current speed and altitude, maybe 14 if we glide. But Major, we are losing control authority. I don't know how much longer I can keep this aircraft stable. Sarah's mind raced through the options with crystalline clarity. The helicopter needed a landing zone. The nearest controlled airfield was Nellie's, but it was too far away. The aircraft wouldn't make it. There were civilian airstrips scattered across Nevada, but none of them were closer. There was the desert floor itself, though the pilot's loss of hydraulic control made a controlled landing increasingly unlikely. And then there was the option that Sarah was already considering, the one that made her palms sweat. Lifeguard 27, have you got visual on any suitable landing areas? Sarah asked, stalling for time while her mind worked through the calculus of the impossible. Negative tower, I'm in a canyon. Terrain is all rock and scrub. I need to get higher, get out of this canyon, find some flat ground. The pilot's voice carried desperation now, the mask of professional composure cracking slightly. I'm Captain James Chen, by the way, former Air Force. I know what I'm doing, but I'm going to need your help to survive this. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. A donor heart. A 22-minute window. A trained Air Force pilot who had the skills to handle this but not the tools, and a patient who depended entirely on strangers to make the right decisions. She pulled up the flight schedule, her eyes scanning the day's operations. There it was. At 10:55 a.m., in exactly 12 minutes, Viper flight was scheduled to conduct bombing operations in the desert region directly northeast of the base. 4 A-10 Warthog attack aircraft, heavily armed and operating in low-level bombing, runs through the exact airspace where the Lifeguard helicopter was currently spiraling toward the ground. Lifeguard 27, stand by, Sarah said. Her mind was crystallizing around the only option that might work. It was dangerous. It violated standard operating procedures. It put multiple military assets at risk. But the alternative was watching a man die, and potentially the person waiting for that donor heart at the hospital. She turned to Tom Reeves, her senior controller. We need to contact Viper Flight immediately and abort their exercise. I'm authorizing an emergency landing corridor through active bombing range airspace. Tom's eyes widened. Ma'am, that's not standard protocol. We'll need to contact command. We don't have time, Sarah interrupted, her voice cutting through his objection like a blade. That helicopter is going to be on the ground in less than 15 minutes, and it won't be a controlled landing. Either we clear the airspace and give them a fighting chance, or we let people die because we followed procedure. She turned back to her radio console, her fingers poised over the communication switches. The weight of the decision settled on her shoulders like a physical force. This was the moment. This was the split second that separated routine from legendary, safe from dangerous, by the book from revolutionary. Lifeguard 27, I am clearing a direct approach corridor to a plateau landing zone at coordinates. She rattled off the numbers, her voice steady as steel. We are going to get you down safely. I am personally taking control of your descent. There was a moment of silence, and then Captain Chen's voice came back, stronger now. Nellie's Lifeguard 27, we are ready to execute your instructions. Thank you. Sarah keyed the frequency for Viper Flight and took a deep breath. Viper Flight, this is Nellie's tower. I need you to abort your exercise immediately. Captain Derek Ghost Patterson was in his element. The 4 Warthog attack aircraft of Viper Flight were screaming across the Nevada desert at 200 knots, their massive shadows sweeping across the red rocks and sandy plains below like predatory birds hunting prey. Ghost sat in the lead aircraft, his gloved hand steady on the control stick, his eyes locked on the target markers displayed on his heads-up display. The weight of the aircraft around him, 30,000 pounds of armored fuselage, twin turbofan engines, and precision-guided weaponry, felt like an extension of his own body. Viper Flight, we are 30 seconds to target run, Ghost transmitted to his squadron, his voice carrying the kind of calm that came from 500 combat hours and a natural aptitude for flying that bordered on supernatural. Weapons armed. Run parameters confirmed. Let's make this a clean pass. 3 voices crackled back in succession. Viper 2 ready. Viper 3 ready. Viper 4 ready. These were his people, his pilots. Ghost had trained with each of them for 18 months. He knew their tendencies, their strengths, their weaknesses. Captain Marcus Reaper Hayes flew Viper 2 aggressive, sometimes too aggressive but brilliant when it came to precision targeting. Viper 3 was Captain Jennifer Phantom Valdez, the first woman to make it into the A-10 pilot roster at Nellie's, and one of the best shots Ghost had ever flown with. Viper 4 was Captain Robert Echo Morrison, the oldest of the group at 41, steady as granite and twice as reliable. The desert landscape below was familiar territory. They'd flown these bombing runs at least 40 times this quarter. The target range had been established for decades, a designated area where the Air Force could practice with live ordnance without threatening civilian populations. Ghost could trace the bombing pattern from memory, approach vectors, target markers, recovery heading back to base. It was as routine as they came. 10 seconds to target, Ghost announced, feeling the familiar surge of focus that always preceded weapons release. This was what he lived for, the precision, the skill, the responsibility of handling an aircraft that cost more than most people would earn in 10 lifetimes. Viper Flight, execute. Ghost's finger twitched on the weapon's release, and he felt the subtle shudder as ordnance dropped from the aircraft's rotary launcher. Around him, he sensed more than heard the release of his wingmen's weapons. The bombing run was picture-perfect, and Ghost was already banking hard to starboard, calculating his recovery vector back toward base, when the radio crackled with something that made every cell in his body go rigid. Viper Flight, Nellie's tower. I need you to abort your exercise immediately and climb to 5,000 feet. Clear all airspace east of your current position. Ghost's brow furrowed. Abort exercises. During an active bombing run. That didn't happen, not ever. The radio discipline was absolute. You didn't abort mid-exercise unless there was an immediate threat to life. His eyes narrowed as he scanned his instruments, looking for signs of conflict traffic or a mechanical emergency somewhere in his squadron. Tower, Viper lead, Ghost transmitted, his voice automatically shifting to a more formal cadence. Current status of all aircraft nominal. Request clarification on abort order. The pause that followed lasted maybe 2 seconds, but it stretched like taffy. Ghost had flown enough combat missions to recognize when something was critically wrong. The air traffic controller's next transmission confirmed his instinct. Viper Flight, we have a medical transport helicopter in distress. Rotor wing with systems failure, critical patient aboard, approximately 30 miles northeast of your position. Aircraft is losing hydraulic control and fuel. I am clearing an emergency descent corridor through your current operating area. Ghost's mind instantly reorganized all the pieces on his mental chessboard. A medical transport, critical patient, systems failure, hydraulic loss. That meant the helicopter was essentially becoming a falling rock with slightly better odds than a stone, and it was about to descend through the exact airspace where his squadron was operating. "Copy tower," Ghost said, and his voice carried a new tone, the absolute authority of a pilot who had instantly shifted from routine training to emergency operations. "Viper Flight, immediate abort. Execute coordinated pull-up all aircraft. Starboard bank climb to 6,000 feet. The response was instantaneous. Ghost felt his aircraft respond as he hauled back on the control stick, feeling the G-forces press against his body as the massive warthog clawed for altitude. Around him, he sensed his 3 wingmen executing the exact same maneuver with the kind of precision that only came from months of training together. They moved as a single organism, 4 pilots thinking with one mind. "Nelly's Viper Flight is clear of target area, climbing," Ghost reported, his eyes already scanning the airspace ahead for signs of the incoming helicopter. "What is the status of that medical transport?" The controller's response was rapid, professional, but Ghost could hear the undercurrent of tension beneath the calm cadence. "Viper Flight, medical transport is inbound to your previous target zone, currently losing altitude, losing hydraulic control. Pilot is requesting guidance to emergency landing zone. Coordinates following." Ghost's hands moved across the control panel with practiced efficiency, punching in the coordinates while maintaining his climb. The numbers painted a picture of a landing zone on a desert plateau, rough, rocky, surrounded by canyons that would make approach difficult for any aircraft, let alone a helicopter with compromised systems. It was the kind of place where most aircraft would end up as wreckage, but it was also the only option available. "Viper Flight, rally point at 6,000 feet, holding pattern over target zone," Ghost commanded, already visualizing the approach pattern. His squadron adjusted their heading in unison, 4 aircraft turning to circle the area where the helicopter would attempt to land. "All aircraft maintain visual scan of the landing zone. If that helicopter gets into trouble, I want us to see it happen." "Viper Lead, this is Reaper," came Marcus Hayes's voice over the radio. "Do we have weapons authority if something goes wrong? Civil aircraft in distress might attract complications." It was a good question, the kind of tactical thinking that made Ghost proud of his pilots, but he shook his head slightly, despite knowing Hayes couldn't see the gesture. "Negative. We're observers now. Our job is to give Nelly's visual confirmation and be ready if ground rescue is needed. Weapons safe, all aircraft." Ghost banked his warthog into the holding pattern and his eyes focused on the distance. Somewhere out there, beyond the shimmer of heat rising from the desert floor, a helicopter was spiraling toward the ground. A pilot was fighting for control of an aircraft that was systematically failing. A patient, someone's father, mother, brother, sister, was depending on strangers to keep them alive. Ghost had flown combat missions over hostile territory. He'd engaged enemy aircraft. He'd faced down surface-to-air missiles. But he'd never experienced a moment quite like this, where the mission wasn't about victory or defense, but about being present for another person's moment of maximum crisis. "Come on, helicopter," Ghost whispered, watching the shimmering desert below. "Come on, you can make it." And then he saw it, a dark speck against the blue sky, moving erratically, descending too fast, struggling to maintain control. "Nellie's Viper lead has visual on lifeguard," Ghost transmitted. "Inbound from the northwest, altitude appears to be 1,400 feet and descending rapidly. Helicopter is definitely in distress. We are maintaining position overhead." The controller's voice came back, calm and steady. "Copy, Viper lead. Maintain position and provide real-time updates. You are now lifeguard's guardian angels." Ghost settled deeper into his seat, watching the helicopter fight its way toward the emergency landing zone. His squadron held formation around him, 4 warriors transformed into witnesses and protectors. "We've got you, lifeguard," Ghost whispered. "We're not going anywhere." Sarah's eyes were locked on the radar screen, tracking the blip that represented Captain Chen's helicopter. The small green dot pulsed steadily, but the trajectory told her everything she needed to know. The aircraft was descending faster than a normal approach should allow. The altitude readout ticked downward with relentless precision. 1,400 feet, 1,300 feet, 1,200 feet. "Status update from lifeguard," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting across the control tower like a whip. Every controller at the station had stopped their routine work. All attention was now focused on this single aircraft and its impossible situation. The radio crackled, and Captain Chen's voice came through, strained and focused. "Nellie's Tower, Lifeguard 27. Current altitude 900 feet, rate of descent 400 feet per minute. I have intermittent control of the aircraft, but hydraulic pressure is continuing to degrade. I am losing the ability to make directional corrections." Sarah's stomach clenched. 900 feet. That meant the helicopter had less than 2 minutes of flight time remaining before it would either land or impact terrain, and the rate of descent was accelerating, which meant Chen was losing hydraulic pressure faster than she'd feared. The margin for error had shrunk to paper thin. Tom Reeves, her senior controller, appeared at her shoulder. His face was pale and his voice carried a note of quiet desperation. "Sarah, we need to abort this approach. Tell Chen to climb back out, get to altitude and head back toward base. We can get him to the civilian airport at Las Vegas. He'll have more time, more options." It was logical. It was safe. It was the textbook response. Sarah understood exactly why Tom was suggesting it, and she understood that every part of her military training was screaming at her to order an abort. Following procedure kept people safe. Breaking protocol caused disasters. But she also understood something else, something that lived in the deeper places of her consciousness, beyond procedure and regulation. The patient aboard that helicopter wasn't a statistic. The donor heart wasn't a hypothetical. Somewhere in a hospital, someone was waiting. Someone was praying. Someone was about to receive a second chance at life, or they were about to lose everything. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the communication console. She took a deliberate breath, holding it for a count of 4, then exhaled slowly. The trembling stopped. Her hands steadied. When she spoke, her voice was ice and iron. "Negative on the abort, Tom," Sarah said quietly. "Get me updated terrain data for the plateau landing zone. I want to know every rock, every ridge, every obstacle within a mile of that location." "Sarah," Tom started, but she cut him off with a glance. "That's an order," she said, and there was no arguing with the tone. Sarah turned back to her radio console, her mind crystallizing around the only path forward. The helicopter was not going to make it back to base. It was not going to reach Las Vegas. The fuel calculation was simple mathematics, and mathematics never lied. Chen had minutes, not hours, minutes. "Lifeguard 27, I need you to focus on getting to the plateau landing zone we discussed," Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence even in desperate circumstances. "I am going to guide you down. I need you to trust me." There was a pause. Sarah could almost hear Captain Chen's mind working through the options, wrestling with the decision to trust his life and his patient's life to the voice of a woman he'd never met. Nellie's lifeguard copies, Chen finally responded. I'm going to trust you, Major. What do you need me to do? Sarah's fingers moved across her keyboard, pulling up every piece of data she could access about the landing zone. Satellite imagery, topographic surveys, wind patterns. The plateau was rough, rocky, surrounded by dangerous terrain, but it was flat enough. Barely. If Chen could get the helicopter down without losing control completely, he might walk away from this. Lifeguard 27, your landing zone is 2 miles due northeast of your current position, Sarah began, speaking with the precision of someone guiding a scalpel through delicate surgery. The plateau is approximately 300 meters long and 200 meters wide. Surface is rocky but relatively flat. Wind is currently from the southwest at 8 knots. You are going to descend on a heading of 045 degrees. Sarah's eyes flicked to the radar screen. 800 feet, 700 feet. The rate of descent was still accelerating. Captain Chen, I need you to reduce your descent rate, Sarah commanded. You're coming down too fast. Ease back on the collective gently. If you drop it too quickly, you'll lose lift entirely. Copy, reducing descent rate, Chen replied. His voice had shifted, no longer panicked but focused. He was a pilot now, not a man in crisis. That shift might save his life. But as Sarah monitored the aircraft's trajectory, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The landing zone was clear, yes, but positioned between the helicopter's current location and that landing zone was a narrow canyon with steep rock faces. If Chen descended in a straight line toward the plateau, he would strike those rocks. The helicopter would become scrap metal and tragedy. Sarah's mind raced through options with the speed of a chess grandmaster calculating multiple moves ahead. She could order Chen to climb and circle around the canyon, but his fuel situation wouldn't allow for that. Every second, every unnecessary maneuver was burning precious fuel. She could order him to land in the canyon itself, but that would be almost certain death. The canyon floor was strewn with boulders and debris. Or she could do something that made her palms sweat and her heart hammer against her ribs. Lifeguard 27, I need you to make a course correction, Sarah said, and her voice carried a note that made Tom Reeves grip the edge of her console so hard his knuckles turned white. New heading 020 degrees. This will take you around the canyon. Nellie's, that heading will take me away from the plateau, Chen responded, confusion evident in his voice. I thought you wanted me. I know what I'm asking, Sarah interrupted, her voice steel. You're going to descend on heading 020. There is a secondary landing zone at coordinates. She rattled off numbers that she'd been calculating in real time, coordinates for a flat stretch of desert floor beyond the canyon, a location that was slightly farther from the plateau but completely clear of obstacles. That location is clear. You can put down there. Tom Reeves's voice was urgent. Sarah, that secondary location is in the restricted airspace south of the bombing range. We haven't cleared that area. Sarah's jaw clenched. She knew exactly what she was doing. The secondary landing zone was technically outside the bombing range, but it was close. Too close. If any remaining ordnance had failed to detonate properly, if there were unexploded bombs in that area, if anything went wrong. Acknowledge new coordinates, Captain Chen, Sarah said, making the decision that would define her career. You have the skills to make this work. You have the fuel to make this work. All I need you to do is trust me and fly the aircraft. There was a moment of silence. Sarah could feel the weight of every eye in the control tower on her. This was the moment. This was the choice that separated safe from necessary, procedure from miracle. Nellie's Lifeguard 27, Captain Chen's voice came through, calm and resolved. New heading 020 confirmed. I'm going to trust you, Major. Let's bring this bird home. Sarah closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second. Then she opened them and began the most critical guidance of her career. Lifeguard, descend to 400 feet and maintain 020 heading. I have you on radar. You are going to make it. I promise you that. Time compressed into something surreal and crystalline. In the control tower, Sarah's world had narrowed to the radar screen, the radio frequencies, and the voice of Captain Chen coming through her headset. Every other sound faded to background noise. Every other concern evaporated. There was only this moment, this aircraft, this impossible descent. "Lifeguard, maintain current heading," Sarah transmitted, her voice carrying an almost hypnotic quality, steady, confident, utterly certain. "Current altitude 400 feet. You are 1 mile from the landing zone. Everything is proceeding perfectly." The radar blip continued its downward trajectory. 390 feet, 380 feet. The rate of descent had stabilized at approximately 300 feet per minute. Sarah's calculations said Chen had roughly 90 seconds before touchdown. 90 seconds to navigate terrain, maintain control of a failing aircraft, and execute one of the most difficult landings of his life. "Sarah, what about Viper flight?" Tom Reeves whispered urgently, his voice carrying the weight of a concern she'd been consciously avoiding. "We haven't confirmed they're clear of the secondary landing zone. If Chen descends into that area and the A-10s are still in the vicinity." "They're clear," Sarah said with absolute certainty, though part of her knew she was gambling with lives. "Ghost and his squadron are professionals. They'll understand what I'm doing." But even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't entirely sure. She'd made an unorthodox call, ordering the A-10s to hold position in the upper airspace while she guided a helicopter down through territory that was technically still within their operating zone. It violated standard operating procedures in multiple ways. It created risk scenarios that training manuals explicitly warned against. If something went wrong, if the helicopter clipped an A-10, if there was a mid-air collision, if anything went catastrophically wrong, the fault would fall squarely on her shoulders. Sarah pushed the thought away. Second-guessing herself now would be fatal. She keyed her radio again. "Viper lead, confirm your current position and altitude," Sarah commanded. Ghost's voice came back immediately, professional and controlled. "Nellies, Viper flight is maintaining 6,000 feet, holding pattern at coordinates specified. All 4 aircraft accounted for. We have visual on Lifeguard. Aircraft appears to be on approach vector toward the secondary landing zone." "Viper lead, I need you to maintain your holding pattern," Sarah said, and there was something in her voice that made Ghost's professional instincts perk up. This wasn't a routine request. This was a controller who was balancing multiple variables in real time and needed her cover force to stay exactly where they were. "You are to remain at or above 5,000 feet until Lifeguard achieves landing. Acknowledge." "Viper lead acknowledges," Ghost replied without hesitation. Whatever was happening down there, whatever impossible situation had developed, his job was clear: stay out of the way and be ready if things went catastrophically wrong. Ghost understood that better than most. In his A-10, Ghost's eyes remained locked on the blue sky below, watching for the helicopter. His 3 wingmen maintained formation around him, their aircraft steady as iron sculptures in the desert sky. Around them, the landscape stretched in every direction: sand, rock, and sparse vegetation, creating a patchwork of earth tones beneath the brilliant Nevada sun. Back in the tower, Sarah's mind was operating at a level of focus she'd rarely experienced. Her eyes tracked multiple data streams simultaneously: altitude, heading, rate of descent, wind speed, the updated terrain data for the secondary landing zone. Her fingers rested lightly on the communication console, ready to transmit the next instruction. "Lifeguard 27, altitude now 300 feet, Sarah announced. "You are half a mile from the landing zone. I want you to reduce speed gradually. Target approach speed 15 knots. "Reducing speed," Chen confirmed, his voice tight with concentration. "I'm losing hydraulic control on the cyclic again. The aircraft is getting sluggish." Sarah's stomach clenched. Sluggish control inputs meant Chen was running out of hydraulic fluid. The backup systems would only last so long, and then the helicopter would become a falling rock, and all the guidance in the world wouldn't matter. "Captain Chen, you're going to make this work," Sarah said, and the certainty in her voice came from somewhere deeper than logic. It came from the place inside her that had guided dozens of aircraft through emergencies, that had learned to trust instinct as much as training. "I need you to focus on the landing zone. Visualize it. See yourself touching down safely. 250 feet. The radar blip descended. 240 feet. 230 feet. And that's when Sarah made the call that Ghost would remember for the rest of his life. "Phoenix, all units acknowledge," Sarah transmitted, using her call sign for the first time since the emergency began. Her voice carried a note of absolute authority, the kind of command that transcended rank and protocol. "I am executing final approach guidance for Lifeguard 27. All aircraft maintain current positions and altitude." Something in that transmission, the use of her call sign, the formal declaration of control, the absolute certainty that everything would be fine, galvanized Ghost's attention. His eyes snapped from the distance to his instruments, where he confirmed that his squadron was maintaining perfect formation and altitude. "Viper lead acknowledges," Ghost responded, and his voice carried a new tone. "Phoenix." They were working with someone who just demonstrated absolute confidence in an impossible situation. That kind of certainty was either the mark of brilliance or insanity. Ghost suspected it was the former. Sarah's guidance continued, a steady stream of instructions and confirmations. 150 feet. Maintain current heading. Landing zone is directly ahead, 1,000 meters. You're doing perfectly, Captain Chen. Everything is aligned. The helicopter descended through the layers of desert air, its rotor blades beating against the atmosphere like the wings of some mechanical bird struggling to achieve the impossible. Inside the aircraft, Captain Chen's hands gripped the controls with white-knuckled intensity, his entire being focused on keeping the helicopter stable, on managing the failing hydraulics, on trusting the voice of a woman he'd never met. 100 feet, Sarah announced. "You have visual on the landing zone." "I have it," Chen confirmed. "I see flat ground, clear approach corridor. It's there, it's real." 50 feet, Sarah continued. "Reduce descent rate to 50 feet per minute. Gentle corrections only." The radar showed the helicopter at exactly 50 feet altitude. The secondary landing zone was directly below, a stretch of relatively flat desert surrounded by rocky outcrops and scrub vegetation. It wasn't perfect. No landing zone in an emergency ever was, but it was survivable. Above, Ghost's 4 A-10s held their formation at 6,000 feet like mechanical guardian angels, their powerful engines thrumming as they circled overhead. For a moment that felt eternal, the entire universe seemed to pause. The helicopter descended. The A-10s held position. Sarah's voice guided with unwavering certainty. 20 feet, Sarah whispered, and in that single word was the weight of 12 years of experience, the gravity of a decision that had broken protocol, the faith that she'd made the right choice. "Touching down," Captain Chen announced, and his voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there before. The fear, the focus, the raw human emotion suddenly broke through his professional composure. "Gentle touch," Sarah instructed. "Let the skids settle naturally." The helicopter descended those final 20 feet with agonizing slowness. The rotor blades beat the desert air. The skids approached the rocky ground. And then, with a gentle bump that was barely noticeable, the helicopter touched Earth. The aircraft settled onto the plateau, its skids making contact with the desert floor, and Captain Chen executed the most important maneuver of all. He began shutting down the engines while maintaining enough rotor RPM to keep the aircraft stable. The landing gear held. The aircraft remained upright. In the control tower, Sarah's hand trembled as she transmitted one final message. "Lifeguard 27, you are safely on the ground. Excellent work, Captain Chen. You just saved a life today." Ghost's voice crackled through the radio moments later. "Nellie's, Viper flight confirms visual of lifeguard on the desert floor. Aircraft appears intact. Outstanding work, Phoenix. That was the best piece of air traffic control I've ever witnessed. And in that frozen moment, with the helicopter safely down and the A-10s holding position overhead like stone sentinels, Sarah Mitchell finally exhaled the breath she'd been holding for the past 5 minutes. The impossible had just become real. The impact was harder than Captain James Chen would have liked, but not catastrophic. The helicopter's skid struck the rocky desert floor with a jarring thud that rattled his teeth and sent vibrations through every fiber of the aircraft. For one terrible moment, Chen thought the landing gear would collapse, thought the aircraft would flip, thought everything would end in twisted metal and tragedy. But the Sikorsky helicopter was built with the ruggedness of a military workhorse, and its frame held. The skids scraped across rocks, sending up a spray of dust and small stones, and the aircraft bounced once, just once, before settling firmly onto the ground. Chen's hands flew across the console with practiced efficiency, his muscle memory overriding the shock of successful impact. He killed the hydraulic systems before they could fail catastrophically. He reduced the rotor speed to a safe idle RPM, preventing the blades from overstressing the now stationary fuselage. He verified that the engines were shutting down smoothly, that there were no secondary system failures, no fires igniting in the engine compartment. Every second of those first 10 seconds after landing was critical. One mistake, one oversight, and the miracle could still transform into tragedy. "Shutdown complete," Chen announced, his voice shaking slightly as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. "We are safely on the ground." Inside the medical compartment behind the cockpit, Dr. Patricia Morrison and her surgical nurse, Michael Torres, had endured those final seconds of descent with their hands locked around the transport pod containing the donor heart. The container was insulated, temperature-controlled, and monitored by a sophisticated array of sensors and life support systems. But in that moment, as the helicopter descended erratically and the rate of descent accelerated, all of those systems felt fragile and inadequate. "Hold tight," Patricia had shouted to Michael as the aircraft lurched sideways. "Just a few more seconds." The impact threw them both forward slightly, straining against their harnesses. The transport pod shifted in its mounting, and for one heart-stopping moment, Patricia thought they were going to lose it, but the restraints held. The pod remained secure. And then, blessed silence. No more engine noise, no more rotor blade vibration, no more the terrible sound of hydraulic systems failing. Patricia looked at Michael, her eyes wide. His face was pale and sweat beaded on his forehead. Without speaking, they both turned their attention to the transport pod, running a rapid visual inspection. All systems appeared to be functioning. The heart inside, someone's father, someone's husband, someone's precious gift, remained viable. "Patient status is maintained," Patricia transmitted to Captain Chen in the cockpit. "No apparent damage to the transport pod. Life support systems all green. We made it." "We made it," Chen echoed, and his voice carried a note of wonder that transcended military professionalism. He'd flown combat missions. He'd trained in emergency procedures, but he'd never done anything quite like this. He'd never defied the odds quite so completely. In the control tower at Nellie's, Sarah's entire body went limp with relief. The tension that had been coiling in her muscles for the past 5 minutes suddenly released, and she found herself gripping the edge of her console so hard that her fingers ached. Tom Reeves placed a hand on her shoulder, and when she turned to look at him, she saw tears in his eyes. "You did it," Tom whispered. "You actually did it." Sarah couldn't respond. Her throat felt tight and her eyes were burning with emotion she couldn't quite name. Relief, yes. Pride, certainly. But something deeper than both, the profound knowledge that she'd made a decision that had saved lives, that somewhere in a hospital a patient was going to get a second chance, that Captain Chen and his team would make it home safely, that the impossible had become possible. Ground rescue teams, Nellie's Tower, Sarah said, her voice slightly hoarse. She cleared her throat and continued with professional precision. Lifeguard 27 has achieved safe landing at secondary landing zone. Coordinates as previously transmitted. Medical transport pod appears secure. Request immediate ground response for patient transfer and aircraft assessment. Within minutes, the coordination that had saved the helicopter in the air transformed into a different kind of coordination on the ground. Desert patrol vehicles were dispatched from Nellie's, racing across the rocky terrain toward the landing zone. Medical personnel at the receiving hospital were notified that the transport would be arriving, though the exact ETA remained uncertain. Ground rescue teams assembled equipment for potential patient evacuation, just in case Chen's assessment of the aircraft's condition was overly optimistic. Above, Ghost and Viper flight maintained their holding pattern at 6,000 feet. Ghost's eyes remained locked on the small shape of the helicopter on the desert floor below, watching for any sign of fire, explosion, or secondary emergency. His wingmen held formation around him, their aircraft like four massive guardian eagles hovering over their charge. "Nellie's Viper lead," Ghost transmitted, his voice carrying a tone of satisfaction that transcended military protocol. "We have confirmed visual of lifeguard on the ground. Aircraft appears structurally intact. No signs of fire or fuel leak. Recommend we maintain position overhead until ground rescue arrives." "Viper lead, you are authorized to maintain holding pattern," Sarah responded. "Excellent work today, Captain Patterson. I want to personally thank you and your squadron for your professionalism and execution." There was a brief pause before Ghost responded. When he did, his voice carried genuine emotion. "Nellie's, the thanks belong to you, Phoenix. Whatever you're calling yourself these days, you just proved why you're the best in this tower. We'll stay here as long as you need us." Sarah felt warmth spread through her chest. She'd worked with Ghost, Derek Patterson, for the past 3 years, and they developed the kind of professional respect that came from countless successful operations. But this moment, this crisis, had forged something deeper. They danced with death together and won. 20 minutes later, the first ground rescue vehicle appeared on the horizon, a cloud of dust trailing behind it as it raced across the desert toward the landing zone. Captain Chen, watching from the cockpit, transmitted a status update. "Rescue vehicle approaching. Medical team in transport pod is stable. We're ready for patient transfer." Patricia and Michael had already begun the preliminary procedures for transitioning the donor heart to the ground-based medical team. The transport pod was being carefully prepared for transfer, its systems verified one final time. Patricia found herself thinking about the person who was waiting for this heart, about their family, about the second chance that was about to be given. As the rescue vehicle pulled up beside the helicopter, kicking up clouds of dust that momentarily obscured the scene, Sarah received a radio transmission from Captain Chen that made her close her eyes briefly. "Nellie's Tower, Lifeguard 27, Chen said, his voice steady and grateful. "On behalf of myself, my medical team, and the patient we're carrying, I want to thank you for saving our lives today. You gave us hope when hope seemed impossible. Whatever you need, whatever I can do to repay that, it's done." Sarah's voice came back soft but clear. "Captain Chen, the best repayment is watching that patient wake up in a hospital bed and hug their family. That's all the reward I need." The transfer of the transport pod to the ground rescue team took less than 5 minutes. Patricia and Michael remained with the pod as it was loaded into the rescue vehicle, their hands steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through their veins. The vehicle's engine roared to life, and it began the rapid drive back toward Las Vegas and the hospital waiting for its precious cargo. Above, Ghost watched the rescue vehicle depart, saw the helicopter secure on the ground with no signs of imminent danger, and finally transmitted the message Sarah had been waiting for. "Nellie's Viper flight is cleared for return to base. Mission accomplished." In the tower, Sarah took a deep breath and allowed herself a small smile. The emergency was over. The impossible had been achieved. And somewhere in the desert, a miracle had just come to ground. The news broke at 12:47 p.m., less than 2 hours after Lifeguard 27 touched down on the desert plateau. A local Las Vegas news station had caught wind of the emergency landing through scanner traffic monitoring, and before Sarah could even finish her official report, the first news trucks were racing toward Nellis Air Force Base. By 3:00 p.m., the story had gone national. By 5:00 p.m., it had gone global. Air traffic controller executes miracle landing, screamed the headlines. Against all odds, how one woman saved a life, proclaimed another. Sarah Mitchell's face appeared on screens across the country, though the photographs were from her official military portrait, a picture she'd never particularly liked, where her expression seemed too stern, her gaze too intense. The media narrative wrote itself. A heroic air traffic controller who broke protocol to save lives, who trusted her instincts over procedure, who represented the best of American military values. Sarah hated it all. She sat in a conference room at Nellis, surrounded by Air Force brass, public relations officers, and various military officials, listening to them discuss her extraordinary heroism and exceptional judgment under pressure. A full colonel was presenting a preliminary recommendation for a commendation medal. The hospital where the donor heart had been transplanted was calling for her to receive a civilian medal of honor. The recipient's family wanted to meet her. "We need to get ahead of the narrative," one of the PR officers was saying. A young woman named Captain Amanda Chen, who spoke with the kind of corporate efficiency that made Sarah want to scream. "Major Mitchell should do an interview with a major news outlet, 60 Minutes or 2020, so we can control the story before it becomes distorted by social media." "With respect, ma'am," Sarah said quietly, "I don't want to do interviews. I want to go back to my job." The room went silent. The Colonel Robert Harrison, base commander, turned to look at her with an expression of mild surprise. "Major Mitchell," he said carefully, "you realize what you've accomplished here. You've become a symbol. People need to hear from you. People need to understand." "I understand perfectly, sir," Sarah interrupted, and her voice carried the kind of authority that made even the colonel pause. "What I accomplished was my job. I'm an air traffic controller. That's what we do. We guide aircraft safely through the airspace. This particular case had higher stakes than usual, but the fundamental principle remained the same: maintain aircraft separation, guide pilots to safe landing zones, prioritize life preservation." Tom Reeves, who had been standing at the back of the room, allowed himself a small smile. That was Sarah Mitchell in a nutshell: pragmatic, focused, unwilling to accept credit for simply doing her job. But the world didn't care about Sarah's reluctance. The narrative had already been written. By the next morning, her call sign, Phoenix, had become a symbol of resilience and redemption. The story wasn't just about a successful emergency landing anymore. It was about a woman who'd trusted her instincts, who'd bent the rules for a higher purpose, who'd proven that sometimes the best outcomes came from breaking protocol when protocol failed. The recipient of the donor heart, a 42-year-old named Robert Martinez who'd been waiting on the transplant list for 14 months, woke up 5 days after the surgery. When his family was permitted to see him, his daughter, Elena, was the first to reach his bedside. She held his hand and cried, not because he was recovering successfully, but because he was alive. Because someone in a control tower had made the right decision at exactly the right moment. Elena wrote a letter to Sarah. "Dear Major Mitchell," it began, "my father tells everyone that you gave him his life back. He doesn't mean that metaphorically, he means it literally. Without you, without your decision, without your guidance, he would be dead. My siblings and I would have lost him. My mother would have lost her husband. And I want you to know that every morning when my father wakes up and takes a breath and experiences another day, that's your gift to him. That's your miracle. Thank you for seeing him as a person rather than a statistic. Thank you for believing that one life was worth breaking the rules for." Sarah read that letter in her office at the tower, with the door closed and her eyes burning. She read it 3 times. She kept it in a drawer at her desk, separate from the commendations and medals and official recognition. Because that letter, Alina's letter, meant more than anything else. 10 days after the landing, Sarah received a visitor. She was preparing for her afternoon shift when one of the junior controllers informed her that she had a guest in the lobby. When she came down, she found Captain Derek Patterson in full flight suit, standing with the kind of posture that suggested he'd just landed and headed straight to the tower. "Ghost," Sarah said, and her expression softened slightly. "What brings you here?" "Had some downtime between training flights," Derek said, but both of them knew that wasn't the real reason. He'd made a point to be here. "Thought I'd check on the woman who saved my day and 3 other pilots' days in one afternoon." They walked out onto the observation deck of the control tower, where the Nevada sky stretched endlessly in every direction. Aircraft moved in and out of Nellies with steady regularity, guided by controllers who would never know that one of their colleagues had just fundamentally altered what was possible in their field. "I've been thinking about that moment," Derek said quietly, standing beside Sarah as they watched the airspace. "When you called out with your Phoenix call sign and ordered us to execute that pull-up. I've replayed it in my mind 100 times, and every time I come to the same conclusion. If we'd hesitated for even 1 second longer, if we'd questioned your order, if we'd gone through the standard verification procedures, we would have collided with that helicopter. We were that close." Sarah nodded slowly. She'd done the same calculations, run the same simulations in her mind. The margins had been razor-thin. The outcome could easily have been tragedy instead of triumph. "But we didn't collide," Sarah said simply. "Because you're a professional, because your training allowed you to execute a difficult maneuver with precision, because in that moment we all chose to trust each other." Derek turned to look at her fully. "You broke protocol, you know. The secondary landing zone wasn't officially cleared. You ordered aircraft into airspace they weren't supposed to be in. By the book, what you did was wrong." "By the book, that helicopter would have crashed," Sarah replied. "By the book, Captain Chen and his medical team would be dead. By the book, the donor heart would never have reached the hospital. Sometimes the book is wrong. Sometimes saving a life requires the courage to break the rules." They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the desert sky and the invisible dance of aircraft, invisible to everyone except those in the tower who knew how to see them. "The Air Force is making a big deal out of this," Derek said finally. "They're already talking about changing protocols, about creating new emergency procedures based on what you did. Your decision is becoming doctrine." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, not quite fear, not quite pride, but something in between. Her decision, her choice to break protocol in that critical moment, was going to influence how thousands of air traffic controllers and pilots operated in the future. The implications were enormous. "That's the real miracle," Sarah said quietly. "Not the successful landing. The fact that we're going to learn from this. That we're going to change the system so that the next time someone faces an impossible choice, they'll have better tools, better procedures, better options." Derek smiled. "Phoenix rises from the ashes," he said. "Appropriate call sign for someone who transforms disasters into new beginnings." 6 months after the emergency landing that became known as the Phoenix Incident, Sarah Mitchell sat in a conference room at the Air Force Institute of Technology in Washington, D.C., preparing to brief senior military leadership on the new emergency protocols she'd helped develop. The room was intimidating. Generals, colonels, and policy makers filled the seats around the polished mahogany table. But Sarah had learned that titles and rank mattered far less than expertise and the willingness to speak truth. "The fundamental principle," Sarah explained, gesturing to the presentation on the screen behind her, "is that emergency protocols should prioritize life preservation over strict adherence to procedure. This doesn't mean abandoning safety regulations. Rather, it means creating a framework where controllers and pilots have the authority to deviate from standard procedures when the situation demands it, provided their decisions are documented and justified. General Margaret Sutherland, the Air Force Chief of Staff, leaned forward slightly. "You're essentially asking us to officially sanction rule-breaking under certain circumstances. How do we prevent that from becoming an excuse for reckless behavior?" "Training," Sarah replied without hesitation. "We establish clear criteria for when deviations are justified. We implement rigorous decision-making protocols. We require controllers to demonstrate understanding of both the rules and the principles behind them. The goal isn't to eliminate standards, it's to create standards that are flexible enough to handle the unexpected." Over the following months, Sarah's protocols were adopted across the U.S. Air Force and eventually integrated into commercial aviation standards as well. What had begun as one woman's impossible decision became doctrine, teaching material, and a fundamental shift in how the aviation industry thought about emergency management. The Phoenix Protocol, as it became known, emphasized the human element of decision-making while maintaining the rigor of military procedure. But the real measure of success wasn't in policy documents or training manuals. It was in the lives it saved. By the end of the first year, the new protocols had been credited with successfully resolving 4 similar emergency situations that would have previously resulted in catastrophic outcomes. Commercial airlines adopted modified versions of the procedures. Civilian air traffic control centers across the country began implementing the principles. What Sarah had done in those critical minutes, trusting her instincts, breaking protocol for a higher purpose, refusing to accept the limitations that procedure imposed, had become a model for decision-making in crisis situations across the entire aviation industry. Sarah was promoted to Chief of Air Traffic Operations for the entire Nellis complex, a position that came with expanded authority and responsibility. She used that authority to revolutionize how the base trained its controllers, implementing decision-making simulations that emphasized ethical reasoning alongside technical skill. She brought in psychologists who specialized in high-stress decision-making. She created mentorship programs where experienced controllers could pass on not just procedures, but the wisdom that came from knowing when to break them. One afternoon, nearly a year after the emergency landing, Sarah received a visitor at her new office. Captain James Chen arrived in civilian clothes, his military bearing still evident in his posture despite the passage of time. But there was something different about him, a lightness, a sense of peace that hadn't been there during their emergency radio communications. "Major Mitchell," Chen said, extending his hand. "I wanted to stop by and thank you in person. I'm being discharged from active duty next month. Honorable discharge, full medical benefits. I'm going to open a flight school for underprivileged kids in southern Nevada." Sarah shook his hand warmly, feeling genuine happiness at his news. "That's wonderful, Captain Chen. What inspired that decision?" "You," Chen said simply. "That day in the helicopter when everything was falling apart, you gave me hope. You treated me like someone worth saving. I want to do the same for others, give kids who might otherwise never have the chance and opportunity to become pilots, to experience the kind of skill and purpose that flying offers." After Chen left, Sarah found herself thinking about the broader impact of that single moment. How one person's decision to trust another person's ability had created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate emergency. Captain Chen was now going to shape the lives of dozens, possibly hundreds of young people. Derek Patterson had been promoted to major and was using his experience to revolutionize A-10 training protocols. Patricia Morrison, the flight surgeon who'd protected the donor heart, had written a paper on critical decision-making in medical transport that had been published in The Lancet. And Robert Martinez, the recipient of the donor heart, had become an advocate for organ donation awareness. He'd started a foundation in his daughter Alina's name, Second Chances, that worked to increase organ donation rates across Nevada. The foundation's stated mission was to help other families experience the miracle that his family had experienced. 2 years after the emergency landing, Sarah stood in the auditorium at the Air Force Academy, preparing to deliver the commencement address to the graduating class. She looked out at the young officers in their dress uniforms, all of them beginning their military careers with idealism, determination, and hope. "You will face moments," Sarah told them, "where the rule book doesn't have an answer, where procedure fails, where the only path forward requires you to make a decision that isn't in the manual. In those moments, I want you to remember this: rules exist for a reason. They keep us safe. They create order from chaos, but rules are created by humans, and humans are fallible. There will be times when following the rule causes more harm than breaking it." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the auditorium. "I'm not giving you permission to ignore protocol whenever it's inconvenient. I'm not encouraging recklessness or rebelliousness for its own sake. What I'm telling you is that sometimes, in those rare, critical moments when lives hang in the balance, you need the courage to trust your training, trust your instincts, and make the right decision even if it means breaking the rules. And when you do that, you need to be prepared to accept responsibility for your choice." After the speech, a young second lieutenant approached Sarah with a question in her eyes. "Ma'am, how do you know when that moment has arrived? How do you know when it's the right time to break the rules?" Sarah smiled. It was the exact question she'd asked herself 1,000 times since the Phoenix incident. "You'll know," Sarah said simply, "because you'll feel it. Your training will align with the moment. Your instincts will scream at you that this is the time, and you'll have to trust that feeling enough to act on it. The only way I can tell you to recognize it is to train yourself relentlessly so that, when the moment arrives, your instincts are worth trusting." That evening, Sarah sat alone in her apartment, looking at the letter from Alina Martinez once more. She'd framed it and hung it on her wall, not as a monument to herself, but as a reminder of why the rules existed in the first place: to protect life, to preserve human dignity, to create a world where people could trust that their lives mattered. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Derek Patterson. "Saw your commencement speech. Still the best pilot I know, even if you never got wings." That was exactly what they needed to hear. Sarah smiled. She thought about that Friday morning almost 2 years ago when she'd sat at her console with a sense of dread and premonition. She thought about the moment when Captain Chen's voice had come through the radio, desperate and afraid. She thought about the impossible choice she'd made. And she realized that the greatest legacy wasn't the protocol changes or the policies or the training manuals. The greatest legacy was knowing that somewhere, someone was living a life they wouldn't have otherwise experienced. Somewhere, a father was hugging his daughter. Somewhere, children were learning to dream of flight. Somewhere, the ripples of one impossible decision were still spreading outward, touching lives in ways that Sarah would never fully know. She took a deep breath and looked out her window at the Nevada sky. The stars were brilliant tonight, and she imagined the invisible highways of air traffic above them. Aircraft moving safely through the darkness, guided by controllers who'd learned that sometimes the best way to follow the rules was to know when to bend them. "Phoenix rises from the ashes," Derek had said. And so it had.